Alright, we're live. Welcome back, everyone, to another free chess lesson on YouTube. I'm Coach Robert, and today we'll be looking at Rook Lifts. So this is part 2 in a series, and we have already done some theory, so if you guys missed that, you can always go check the recording for Rook Lifts part 1. And the too long don't read of that one is that there's this thing you can do called a Rook Lift. And the Rook Lift, I'm always sloppy about this. Yeah, the Rook Lift is a thing that you can do where instead of waiting for a file to open up magically by trading some pawns, you will probably push at least one of your pawns to make room for your rook to come up and over the front. In fact, now that I use that phrase, I think that the Chess Kid video for Rook Lifts has some kind of mnemonic device that's like rook rover, rook up and over, so that you remember that it's like up, the rook goes up, and then the rook goes over. And it could happen in a variety of different situations, so it's good not to oversimplify it, but keeping in mind that we're going to move the rook up the board and then possibly change wings. That's the Rook Lift idea. So for this first one, we're going to focus on problem solving, and I'm going to show a classic example from the beginning. So let's get started. So this game is Lasker versus Bauer. This is a pretty famous game from, I can't remember what year it was. Let me see. I scroll down a little bit. 1889, old game. But not that old. It was when Capablanca was 1 year old that this game occurred. So this is just the start of the game. Interesting stuff. I think that people often handle the bird's opening differently these days, but since it's such a rare opening, people, aren't necessarily that prepared for it. But I think back in the late 1800s, this was maybe even more common than it is today. Bishop d3 is a sort of unusual choice, but it turns out that this move is key for the interesting motif that we'll see. That also involves a rook lift, so let's just move on with it. So both sides are finishing their development, and black is choosing knight d7, so they could probably play c5 later. White has pretty much forsaken ever playing d3 and d4, so we're seeing more maneuvers with the pieces. And now, interesting point, both bishops are facing the king side. That'll become important later on. I would say black's setup is pretty typical, even by modern standards. And here white played knight e5, which is a fine move. And probably somewhere around here the trouble is beginning for black. This position is going to be white to play. We'll be solving it that way. And they took with the bishop. Taking with the pawn is also interesting, but this keeps the bishop active in terms of how it relates to the king side. And now there's a kind of hidden threat here. Not very hidden. If black could play 2 moves in a row, it would be checkmate. It played d4 and queen g2. So, Lasker. And by the way, I should clarify, this is Emanuel Lasker. There were 2 different very strong Laskers in chess history. So this one's Emanuel Lasker. And after a6, we reach our critical moment where we need to think about not just the Rook Lifts pattern, but the tactical and strategic factors at play here. So this example showed up in a lot of tactics books in the past. It's very very well known. I think it's best known for its double bishop sacrifice, which is a huge hint about what the answer of this puzzle is. I decided to include it even though it's very famous, and the focus is mainly on the sacrifice of the bishops, because I think you can't really understate how important it is to include the rook in this attack. maybe we should rationalize why an attack makes sense in this position, because an attack doesn't make sense in just any position. So first of all, white has completed their development. Sometimes white can go for a skirmish even before their development is finished, or any side can. But when all of your pieces are on their best squares already, and it's hard to improve them, it starts to seem like if you don't do something now, all of the benefits of having your pieces so thoroughly arranged in their best ways, it can only go downhill from there. So you need to strike and change the nature of the position so that you can utilize that pent-up power in your position. And this is a principle that dates back to Stanitz, the first world chess champion. I think he stated it that if you have all of your pieces in their best possible places and you have the advantage, if you don't do something with it, you will lose that advantage. And that's probably not necessarily true, especially in the context of modern chess. But the fact that this was on the mind of the first world chess champion does lend it some credence, that we should probably pay attention when our pieces are already ideally placed and not miss an opportunity to strike. It doesn't mean that we should be looking for a killing blow in every single position, but when all the pieces are really great, that's a signal. Now, that being said, here, well, in other positions, I think that just because all of your pieces are well placed doesn't mean you should sacrifice something and go for the attack. There have to be some signs from your opponent as well. First of all, I like to look for some significant weaknesses. Here, I would say black has chosen a fine setup. They don't have any really permanent weaknesses. You could argue about maybe like b6, but that's academic and outside the scope of what we're doing today. Definitely you could argue that white even has some weaknesses using that same logic. But let's focus on the activity of the pieces here. So we already talked about how these bishops are really, really good. And these two bishops are sort of in the starring role here. It's part of why this game's so famous, because these two bishops did something really great here in just a few moves. This knight is, as a short-range piece, poised relatively well to move to the king side, or help support like an f5 advance or something like that. The caveat of the knight being on g3 is probably that it obstructs a few other pieces, potentially. It could obstruct the bishop, or the rook, or the queen, or even the g-pawn, depending on how white wanted to proceed. So the knight's not ideally placed. I would say that like g3, b3, b6, g6, they're not great places to be a knight long term. But if we're thinking just about the attack, we have this sort of myopic view of the world. The only thing that matters now is sort of in this box. We really want to just take over this area and checkmate the king, if we're thinking attack. Another thing that's nice about white's position is that with the pawn on f4, this rook is ready to join the fray, either on the f-file or maybe with a rook lift, as we'll see. The rook on a1 is not doing much. As for black, I think they have some specific concrete problems with their development. Their king side looks pretty good, right? We have a knight on f6, typical, good. Bishop on e7, pretty normal, nice. It could be more active in a different structure, but in this position it makes sense on e7. What I'm questioning is this bishop on b7 and the queen on c6. The fact that these pieces are on the light squares on the queen side is what makes me feel that maybe white has some chance of a real attack. Basically, this bishop can never join the defense of the king side. For instance, an attack on h7 can never be guarded with the bishop. So, even though the structure is good for black, when I see it, I'm often pretty glad when I'm on the white side, because if I can lock out this bishop or play rapidly so that they can never bring it to the king side, I might be able to take advantage of the light squares. So this points out that the weaknesses potentially could just be these light squares. It's also a little tricky to bring this bishop to guard g7, so we could even say like maybe g7 is a weakness. But if I had to pick just one, probably I would focus on h7. That seems kind of weak. in terms of the poorly placed pieces in this position, I would say like maybe this rook is poorly placed. And for here, I don't really think their bishop's that well placed. If they could get in d4 without me playing, for instance, e4, and if I had maybe played g3 already, I would not be arguing that this bishop is that poorly placed. Some changes need to happen for this bishop to be well placed. And so now we just need to kind of calculate and see what's going on here. So for anyone who's just joining us, we're looking for white to play and how we should start an attack on the king side, and a rook lift will factor in at some point. Maybe since I'm talking about rook lifts specifically today, it makes sense to talk about this move. Like, why don't we just go ahead and play this move? Just making a note to myself. This is the first time I'm looking at this variation. So why don't we just go ahead and play rook f3? You know, the lessons about rook lifts, why don't we just rook lift all the time? What will black go ahead and do here? I think the answer to that question might be d4. It just seems like the really active choice. But it does also involve a pawn sacrifice, so I would say this is maybe just a candidate move for now. Perhaps I would try to shore up my dark squares. Could play knight d7. With the idea of playing like f6. So this is also an idea for black. What other ideas does black have here? Maybe the temporary use of the light squares. Could play like knight g4, be a little more active about it, instead of knight d7. Maybe with the idea of playing f5, like we go here, and then whatever white does next, we're going to play pawn f5 and lock up the king side. I think the point here is that if you play rook f3 immediately, you're not really like coming in to do something. You're just kind of lifting because I said so. So rook f3 doesn't make sense quite yet. I think black has a variety of interesting options. Perhaps even c4, which I think might have been one of black's main ideas. Or maybe they'll just play b5 to say you're really slow, I'm going to play c4 on the next move. So lots of options there. The move that was played was knight h5. And this is initiating a combination. White is much better here. So let's see what happens. If they take, it's kind of obvious that it's helping white. So maybe we can see what happens if they don't take on h5. If we play, for instance, what's a logical move here? Well, first of all, avoidance doesn't quite work. Like knight d7, knight e8, maybe it's too passive. We could consider knight e8 because at least you're not losing the g-pawn in an obvious way. If you play knight d7, this is just bad. Put a mark on it. I think here the obvious solution is to take this, and white should be winning. Like their king is just so weak. But even knight e8, I think there's a problem. So this is a tactical moment here. White to play and win. And if you want to say it in the chat, feel free. Or if you're watching the recording, you could pause here and see if you can solve this as a tactic. The weak spot is clearly g7. It's attacked twice and defended only twice. So I made a video about the notion of like weak spots and tactical targets. So if you have a hard time identifying that g7 is in fact a weakness, you should check out that video. Just search tactical targets on my channel. So whenever I see something that's defended a couple times and attacked a couple times, I like to think about what would happen if I bring more attackers on that spot. For instance, the move queen g4 naturally comes to mind. They would probably play a move like g6, and the pressure's in all likelihood gone. Maybe you could even play pawn f6 to to be a little more aggressive about it. So queen g4 is a nice idea, but it doesn't work as a first move. So the next thing is to look at forcing ways to combine with queen g4 and the other options. So I would say the answer to this puzzle is bishop takes g7. And the reason is that they just don't have a defense of g7 anymore. If they take it, we have queen g4 now, and now g6 is impossible. So this is the logical next variation to look at. If they play bishop f6, we just take that, and then we should be really pleased to be here. So this is why knight e8 is not working. Maybe just to avoid being excessively academic about it, we can just look at the main line, which is knight takes h7. I'm sorry, knight takes h5. So they're taking the piece, and just because the piece is hanging doesn't mean we should immediately play queen takes h5. I would consider what happens if we play it. I just want to point out that this is a good moment to look for intermediate moves. When you're in the middle of the attacking sequence, it's good to avoid playing obvious moves. You should be a little thorough, because checkmate could be close at hand. Now here, if we play queen takes h5, black can defend their king side. I'm looking to see if they have multiple defenses. I think the most obvious one is g6, because it comes with tempo. If they play the move queen h6 threatening mate, we can play the move pawn f6, and I would say this is going to end in a draw. Because here white can force a draw. If you want to pause and see if you can find the forced draw, then go right ahead. We should sacrifice with a checkmate threat. Here the threat's queen h7, so they have to take, and then they can just go ahead and make a draw like this. But you know, even here I'm wondering, I think it's possible that white is still winning. Maybe it's, so you can force a perpetual for sure, but here we can actually use the rook lift idea. So again, if you're watching the recording, you could pause. But we want to checkmate the king, see if they're trapped completely on the edge of the board now by the queen, and we have one move to do whatever we want, so I would play rook f3. And I think this is lights out. Rook h3 is coming. So I guess f6 is actually not a good defense, which means that g6 is not a good defense, because here there's no way to guard g7 except for f6. So the most obvious move isn't so good. Another move that came up a few times when I was just kind of intuiting the situation here is f5, because this closes the light squares forever. It makes e5 into an outpost square for the bishop, but we should be able to get bishop f6 in if things get dangerous. For example, well, here white doesn't even have a one-move threat on g7, so this probably nips the attack in the bud, as they say. So I think f5 is good enough there. Maybe you could play h6 as well, but it's probably not worth looking into. So at any rate, it looks like they do have good things to do against queen h5. Some variations are good for white, but some look like black is holding on. So it makes sense to look for other moves here. So if anyone wants to suggest another move, feel free. Or if you're watching the recording, pause and see if you can guess what else white could try here. Shai has it. It's bishop takes h7. Really good move. I think they can only really take it because if they move to the side, we have queen takes h5, and it's obviously game over. We're threatening bishop g6 no matter what, and I don't think they can defend whatsoever. So definitely king h7, and Shai, I think the obvious follow-up for you is queen h5, right? So we're really analyzing this position now. And Shai, I bet you've actually seen this famous game, so I'm wondering what you think about this one. Another good moment to pause. Our lesson's about rook lifts, but that doesn't mean that it's always a rook move. The rook lift just ends up being important at some point. So I would say right now we're still looking at the most transparent ways to get at the king. You might want to consider a rook lift, but you should also see if there's any alternatives or good defenses for the opponent. Alright, so it looks like Shai's examining bishop takes g7. I think that's very logical. It threatens mate. It clears the defense of the king. We could even go down that path right away. Yeah, it is good. Bishop takes g7. They have to take it. But how do you follow up here? It's important to follow up accurately. By the way, this position's a pretty good calculation exercise from the very beginning. If your ratings or if your playing strength is somewhere around expert, like 2000 or something. But even moment by moment, it's a good training position for various levels. Yeah, so queen g4 is nice, and I think there are really two main things here. If you play king f6, the game ends at once. So this is the mate in one. If people want to pause or just shout it out. Yeah, queen g5, nice. So even if the bishop wasn't there, this would still be mate. That's kind of an interesting point. So king h7 is the really other critical move here. Yeah, and now Shai has it, so we're going to do the rook lift now. So the reason I chose this example is that even though it starts with this spectacular double bishop sacrifice that this game is famous for, the rook lift comes in clutch at the very end. It's an important component of many attacks on the king to do a rook lift. This one really finishes it off. So let's say they play e5 here. This is what happened in the game. And it's not really trivial to finish, because after the move e5, unexpectedly there's counterplay. So let's try to calculate this until the end. And by the end, I don't mean checkmate. I mean until you get a winning position where you're confident that you have a big advantage. The obvious move to think of is rook h3. So I'll just put an arrow while we think about this. So after rook h3, how is this going to finish? This game was Lasker versus Bauer from 1889, which was 1 year after Capablanca was born. And Lasker was world champion, I believe, when this game happened. So it's interesting that Capablanca would eventually succeed Lasker when he was 1 year old when this game was played. So I'm looking for a kind of a conclusive variation here. Several moves. I usually don't ask for a long, deep calculation, but here, since all of Black's responses are kind of forced, I think at least a variation that's a couple moves long is pretty reasonable. Black doesn't have any options, so there's really nowhere to go astray when you're visualizing this deeply. A good calculation exercise, but I'd say a pretty easy one. Maybe the hard part is if you're predisposed to look for mate forever, you're never going to find it. There's not really an immediate checkmate here unless Black makes a big mistake. So the hard part really is making candidate moves and knowing when to stop calculating. So after rook h3, they can only really play one move. Bishop h4 makes no sense, so they're going to play queen h6. The reason bishop h4 makes no sense is it doesn't improve Black's position at all. Their king is still unsafe. We would just play rook takes h4, and then after queen h6, things are still bad. In fact, I'm wondering if queen takes h4 is better. It'd be queen takes h4. If king g7, it's queen h7, king f6. It looks kind of messy. King f6, rook h6. Okay, yeah. So queen takes h4 would be better in the case of bishop h4, but that's a silly line. Like, black would never play that. So really what we need to look at is queen h6. So I'll put an arrow for that one too. It's kind of obvious that we should consider rook takes h6, but it's not necessarily the case that we should, because the queen is pinned after all. But just to save you guys some effort, I'll just point out that rook takes h6 is a very forcing line. We should really consider it. I wouldn't consider a move like queen f5 just because it's not the obvious move. I would kind of look at it and say, like, yeah, I don't see any fantastic reason to go ahead and play that move. So rook takes h6 would be my main move to start the calculation. So we're thinking we take, they have to take back, and then we're looking for a good move at the end of the line. After the king takes, white to play and do something really great. I'll try to color these differently, so you know it's move 2. And then white to play and win at the end. I'll take the arrows off. Probably don't need it. Yeah, Shai has it. It's queen d7. Nice job. And this is really just it. So here, if we don't look one move further, this is actually not a clear position, because black could get counterplay along the G and H files and open up the position with d4, and then maybe white is going to have to work hard to win the game. For instance, if white plays a lackluster move like maybe something obvious like this, I'm tempted to just play rook d8 with the idea of playing something like d4, or maybe rook g8 or rook h8, maybe bringing the king back to f8 before trying to improve the other pieces. And I don't think this is that simple. Like, maybe you play rook f3, rook f1, intending rook f3 to h3, but after rook g8, no, this should still be pretty good for white. I think I'm just not defending very well because I haven't thought about this position before. Maybe instead of rook d8, it's... Well, anyway, so I think that there is counterplay here. But once you see queen d7, any chance of counterplay is pretty much shot, because the counterplay centers on having the bishop pair and attacking on the king side, and you're going to lose an extra bishop. It's just not going to happen. So this is how Bauer resigned, I think, in the game. This whole sequence happened. And one of the key takeaways is that even though we start out with, first of all, placing the bishops in this intelligent way. So when bishop d3 happened, it's sort of an unusual situation. Probably black had to play much more actively to punish this move. So it really starts here with Lasker placing his two bishops to attack the only place where black will reasonably castle their king, and then maneuvering his knight to the king side, exchanging the knights that defend the king. So we're exchanging the knights. So it starts with all this, which is stuff that has to do with the bishops and the queen, and also like liquidation of the pieces, like things that have nothing to do with the rook lift. But if it wasn't possible to play at some point rook f3, I think this attack would not be a real thing. If you had to, I don't know, have one hand behind your back tied or something, or like this rook is stuck with glue on f1, and say, I need to win with just the bishops and the queen, not possible. This is a very common motif. We sacrifice the minor pieces and then bring in another piece like a rook, often with a rook lift. Okay, so here's my next example. And this one is, we're starting already in the position where things are getting interesting. And this one is Janowski versus Lasker. And the year was, let me see the year, 1909. So this is later on in chess history. And Lasker is again using this rook lift thing. So maybe getting the idea here that Lasker is pretty good at this rook lift stuff. This is another situation where I think black's pieces are potentially on their best possible squares, which is, as we just talked about in the other example, a sign that an attack might be imminent. Maybe we should go for it. But only if you think your opponent really has nothing going for them. You need to have some kind of positional superiority near their king to go for the attack, even if your pieces are ready, because, white's pieces are ready too. So, what defects are there even in white's position? Maybe the fact that their bishop is passive on f1, or the fact that the rooks are attacking g6 and g6 is not vulnerable. The way the position is kind of closed and black has a knight against a bishop, these could all be considered maybe defects for white. Both sides have similar problems with the pawn structure. The blockaded doubled f pawns for white looks especially ugly to me. So these kinds of things make me think maybe attacking makes sense. So how do we go for it? What do you guys think? The good thing to think about maybe is like what white wants to do. So if you pick a move, you might have a hard time testing it in your mind if you just don't know what your opponent wants. So I would probably say that white wants to either open lines for their rooks or improve their bishop. So you might want to consider both for whatever move you pick. I don't really think white wants to play a move like d5. That's the kind of move that might come to your mind if you're very focused on forcing moves. It's forcing, so it's good to look at it, but you have to dismiss it immediately, because after d5, knight c5, there really aren't any more interesting forcing moves. And the knight just got a really great square on c5, so probably that's it. And of course, if you're watching the recording, this is a great place to stop. And think for black. You might think that doing a rook lift doesn't make sense here, because usually when you're doing a rook lift, it's like what they say on Chess Kid, right? You do rook up and over. But here there's no over because all the pawns are on the 6th rank. Like, you can do rook up, but then you can't do rook over. So what's the point? Well, you're allowed to change the pawn structure too. Sometimes you have to combine the rook lift with some pawn moves to get it fully activated. So that's a hint for this one. Another question that might help here is, what is the worst placed piece for black? Because we have two rooks, we might want to choose between them, or maybe do some preparatory moves if we are going to improve the rooks later. Whichever piece is the worst, you might want to put it on a better square. And this is a hard question here, because it looks like black's pieces are all doing pretty well. I would say that this rook is the worst placed piece, though, on f8. To test whether or not it's the worst placed piece, that might be actually an interesting video concept. Like, how do you even know which piece is the worst placed? To test whether or not this rook is poorly placed, I guess you could imagine a few scenarios in abstract. Like, what happens if the E and F pawns are traded? At the end of the day, your rook's still going to be looking at your F pawn on F4, because that pawn's not going anywhere. So the F file's like pretty closed, so maybe for that reason we want to improve that rook. You could also ask yourself, like, well, what's good about the rook on E7? It guards all the pawns on the 7th rank. I think that's pretty important. And the E file has potential to open up, so maybe you want to keep an eye on the E file. Alright, let's see. I'm probably about to share the first move. So if you have any guesses, feel free to guess right now. This might be one of those examples where it's kind of like you see it or you don't, because there's a tactical idea that's enticing, and it makes you want to play the move Rook f6. The idea that makes me want to play Rook f6 has to do with the fact that the king is really stuck on the h file. Shai actually got it, like, you know, he's a buzzer beater here. I said Rook f6 and he also said Rook f6, so that's a good guess. So, Shai, I'm wondering what you think your next move will be here. Yes, because lift. So we've lifted it, but it's blocked on both sides. It seems kind of weird that we're doing this. But it's not that weird when you consider what black's next move should be. Let's say that white plays bishop d3. Excuse me. The idea with bishop d3 is that if white immediately plays the move e takes f5, we are going to take with the rook, and our rook is fully activated. So bishop d3 is kind of an ambitious move. We're saying, I want to take so that you can't take with the rook. I want you to take with a pawn. So I can play like rook g8, checkmate. So this is their idea. So we need something that's quite strong here, because white's idea is very sensible. They want to leverage their strength on the light squares. They're attacking the strong points in black's territory to try to open up other weak points, like g8. So how are we going to start our own play in time? What's going to happen here? Yeah, Shai has the idea. He said the idea is to play queen h3 and at some point bring a rook to the h file, so you should play g5, and this is accurate. Yeah, you should definitely play g5 here. I want to point out, at the end I'll point out why you don't start with g5, because you might think it also makes sense to go this way, but it doesn't quite, for tactical reasons. But now it makes a lot of sense. We've activated the rook, now we're playing g5. Usually when you do a rook lift, you improve the pawns and then you activate the rook, but here it's kind of like you improve the f-pawn, then you improve the rook, then you improve the pawn. So sometimes there's a bit of work to do. So anyway, here they took on f5, and we should consider one other line. This move just demonstrates black's idea, which Shai was alluding to. It's queen h3, king h3, rook h6, and now after king g4, this is the detail you have to see, rook h4 mate. A really nice checkmating idea, which hinges on this rook lift. So let's go back, actually, and see what happens if white plays rook h1. This might be kind of a, not very interesting line, so let's not spend too much time on it. What do you guys think we should do here for black? Maybe it's unfair for me to call it uninteresting, I don't know. Similar to the last line. I think the second move is what's more interesting here. The first move's kind of in keeping with what we want to do already. We just have to choose wisely what comes next. Okay, so the move is queen h3, and if they take it, this is really, really bad, because we're going to play the same rook h6, but this time it's mate, because they didn't get rid of the f-pawn. That's why that was a critical line. So they have to go here, and you might think white's getting counterplay, like maybe the queen's trapped or something, or maybe there's enough pressure against the king, but I really don't think so. After queen f3 here, what I see is a position in collapse for white. They're not doing well. I don't think you need to see like the end of the line or something here. It's just like the position is good. White can't coordinate. h7 is safe. Black has a lot of positional trumps here. So this is this example, which was Janowski versus Lasker. Janowski had the misfortune of losing to many really strong players. Or maybe the good fortune, hard to say. Okay, here's the next example. This one's kind of a quick example. Probably it's like you have to see the first move and then the rest is easy, if I had to guess how you guys are going to feel about it. So this one's white to play, and this is from 2016, from the Olympiad that occurred in that year. Where was I in 2016? I think 2016 was the year I became a candidate master, and I was playing chess actively. And it was before the flood. There was no pandemic or anything. Yeah, Shai got the first move. This is kind of a no-brainer. Rook e4 with the deadly threat of bishop g7. So they have to react to this. They played f6 to prevent. And probably the next move's obvious too. But if you guys want to pause or just shout it out in the chat, what should white do here? Keeping with the theme of the rook lift. Like in the phrase, they say the rook goes up and then over. So rook h4. And after rook h4, I don't really know what to say for black. Their position's very, very poor. So they played e5, which doesn't struggle very hard. White to play and win. Just a small tactic here. Yeah, I think Shai has the combination. Rook h7, and after king takes, we have queen 2, not h3 because the bishop's guarding it, but queen h4. Yep, and that's it. That's me. Classic me. You can do a lot of puzzles like this for free online chess. They have a whole motif section, and I think learning by motif is good. In fact, I'm going to put out a video pretty soon about why you should solve by pattern and not by random problem set. But I want to do a little bit of research on like education papers to support my opinion before I go for that. So this was a tiny one, tiny puzzle. Let me see. This one is Rager versus Fogel, and the year was 2018. This one is probably much more sophisticated than the last couple examples. White to play. And the question really is, how do we conduct the attack? Yeah, Shai, I'm glad to know that you'll be interested in that video. It's one of my priorities. I could make the video right now. Like, I could go offline after the live stream and just make the video presenting my views, but I want to substantiate my views because I think a lot of people, they just say stuff and they don't qualify it with research, even when research is available. There's like, this is my opinion, do things because I said so, I'm popular, and I don't really want to do that. I mean, I could, and I think it would be a good video, but I'd like to give people the option to go read, like, why do people believe that people learn better in certain ways? I think that would be really cool. But since education research is not my area of expertise, since I really am familiar with literature of a completely different kind, it might take me some work to actually get the video going. It's part of my series that's going on about how you should think about improving. Since I think there's a lot of misinformation right now, especially from streamers, about like what it takes to get titled and things like that. Of course, I'm still in the process. It's not like I'm a GM or something, only candidate master. But I did it mostly on my own, and I came up with most of the approaches that I've attempted, so I think I'm pretty well qualified to talk on the topic. Especially for adult audiences, because I think for kids it's kind of like, you know, if you sit and play chess for a long time, you'll probably improve, especially if you get a coach, especially if you watch good content. So I don't think kids are the ones who are really necessarily struggling to find the best technique. It's the people who are strapped for time and energy who still want to improve. They might need more targeted content about self-studying. Alright, so let's look at this position a little bit. There's one thing about this position that really makes me think white is better and should consider attacking. The factor is the pawn structure around the king. These pawns are all on light squares. And where's the light square bishop? Nowhere. And oh look, here's a light square bishop looking right at them. What a coincidence. It seems like we should be able to exploit this somehow. Shai, I wonder if you could elaborate on your pincer maneuver. I'm not sure I'm familiar with it. Unless it's a meme, in which case maybe I do now. So we have a really good position on the light squares. The knight on c6 is offside. I don't see how the knight on c6 is going to join the defense of the king side. In fact, g6 sort of eliminates their main way of getting back. They can't really go this way. The fact that the f7 pawn is blockaded means they can't go this way. So I'd say this knight is just not participating. So we have two bishops against one bishop when it comes to the attack on the king side. Okay, Shai has a nice idea. I think I know what you're talking about now. So queen h6, I think there's a name for this kind of attacking idea. It might be this pincer thing that you're saying. I remember I made a video about ranking the checkmating motifs, and there was one where I said I didn't even know this had a name. I think that was the one. So the idea is to play queen h6 and get on g7, but then the issue is that there's this bishop f8, which defends everything. So I think when you have this idea, no, even if this video is about rook lifts, you should consider these ideas. I think that makes a lot of sense. In fact, thinking about things that are unrelated can help bring you to the right answer, just like during a real game. So after queen h6, the ways that I would deal with bishop f8 are either one, get rid of that bishop. If it doesn't exist, they can't play bishop f8. That seems like a very far-fetched goal right now. The other thing to do is make it so that when they play bishop f8, you have a secondary attacking idea in play. So I would consider those lines, where maybe we don't play queen h6 on move 1, because obviously they have bishop f8 right away, but we could prepare it so that when we finally go for queen h6, which is a very strong idea, bishop f8 doesn't work for other tactical reasons. So I think we're honing in on the fact that here, instead of playing queen h6, we need to do a rook lift. And how? How do we do the rook lift? We need one more piece in the attack, because just going for it on g7 isn't good enough. We have two rooks to choose from. Which one should we lift and how? I think it's interesting that Shai says that rook e3 feels slow but possible, because I think a few times in the past, Shai, you would often suggest a good move and say it just seems really slow. So you might want to be cognizant of that. Rook e3 is the best move here, at least according to my analysis. I haven't checked this with a computer. Sometimes you don't need to be that fast, because you have some kind of powerful positional idea that's impossible to avoid. Yeah, and g4 is coming afterwards, so this is a lot like the last couple examples. So rook e3, and let's see what happens if black plays some common sense move, like I'm trying to think about this in a fresh way. I had like a couple moves that I looked at here. I looked at b4. I don't know if that's really like that good now that I look at it again. I looked at bishop takes f6 because it's forcing. Let's look at d4 just for fun, okay? I'm making a note to myself that I'm looking at this now. Okay, so idea here is maybe just to like slow down white in order to get the move knight takes d4 in. Like, I think probably an ideal variation for black might be c takes d4 because it's free. They play rook a d8, and then white does something kind of not useful, and they get knight d4 in. Maybe that's good. All right, bishop f8. Maybe we could look at that one because I actually don't think this is even that great. Like, even if black gets everything they want, I think your idea of playing g4 is still very strong here. So maybe we could look at bishop f8. Just defending. I imagine you would still play the move g4 though, which also has the dual purpose of stopping h5. h5 is sort of a defending idea here. Yeah, so g4 is coming. And I'm not really sure what black can do to even stop it. Even the move d4, first of all, you have rook h3, but even if you didn't, you could like take and take on g6, and that should be winning as well. Like, everything looks winning here. So that's kind of just looks good. Like, you know, whatever here, rook h3. If they play h5, we take, and everything's good in the world. It doesn't matter. So maybe we should look at the critical line of bishop takes f6. This is what I thought was maybe testing. And the reason it's testing is not because it eliminates an attacker on the king. E takes f6 replaces the attacker on the king. g7 is still our target. The reason this is challenging is that there's this high-level defending move, queen d6. I've kind of already given it away. Maybe I should have paused here. I'm giving this an exclamation point in my notes just because this is a classic way of trying to defend your king. If we play queen h6, the defending move, if you want, you can pause to think, if we go here, how's black going to stop our attack? It's pretty simple. It should just be queen to f8. So this wins a tempo for black to try to defend their king better. And here white needs to find something good. I guess the natural question is g4 good enough? So we might consider the move g4. Like, is this still winning the way it was in the other lines? I'm looking for a defense for black here. And I think I see one. If you guys want to pause here and see if you can find a good defense for black, this is a good moment. I'm going to show my idea in just a second. I think that we can play queen f8 here. I should probably mark that I'm looking at this for the first time. I try to keep version notes for all my games, at least a little bit. So, sorry, g4, queen f8, and if you play rook h3, I think this is a good idea. Because you can't access the g7 weakness anymore. And if you trade queens, you win a pawn, but all the attack is just gone out of the position. So sacking a pawn to defend your king is very logical. I think black would continue with the move e5, which has a couple ideas behind it. Like, you want to play the move e4 and shut out the bishop. You want to play rook e6 and take the pawn on f6, which I don't know if that's like realistic. White might still be better here. It feels pretty good for white, but the attack is gone. So this might be a good way to defend. Maybe there's even something stronger than queen f8 that I'm just not seeing here. Another more active move could be Queen f4. Maybe this is even better than that, because now after Rook h... First of all, you can't play g5, but second of all, after Rook h3, I could play h6 here. Maybe this is like, where's the mate? You know, we're playing the where's the mate game. You know, you go here and I just run away because the queen guards h8. This looks a little bit better to me. All right, Shai has a good question. He said, in the line where we trade queens, do we just have forever to bring the rook in? I didn't really think about it because I think the character of the position has changed a lot. Assume you mean for black? I don't feel like we have forever because we do have weaknesses. Like d5 is kind of weak. We don't really want to allow them to get another rook on h3. Like, imagine if the rook could just go on h3 right now. That would be devastating. So we need to create counterplay right now. It's not like a slow position just because queens are off. But I think there's a lot of... There's good stuff for them to go for. Alright, so for the white rook on the d file, I think you should act quickly to bring it in. Like, let's say black plays e5 here, and you just want to do another rook lift. Like, you are rook lift insane, you just really want to rook lift everything, so you go here. As black, I kind of want to sack the d-pawn to survive. So I think here I might consider g5. Maybe I even should have considered g5 in the last move. No, maybe e5 is kind of dumb. Hold on. Yeah, it's hard to say here what's the best. Oh, knight e5 looks good. Idea is if you play g5, I play knight f3 and win the g-pawn. So this is provoking white to do something, and it controls d3, so there's no rook d3. I don't know, I suddenly feel very good about knight e5. I might just leave it right here. I don't think this is okay. I don't think white can tolerate this. Playing f3 or h3 means no more rook lift heaven. And hello, Anand. Welcome to the chat. Yeah, rook e1 instead of bishop. That also makes sense. So that's kind of why I felt like I needed to go back. I think e5 was lazy. It was just the first thing that came to my mind. But knight e5 looks good. It's forcing. I really should have thought of that first. Here, if you try like rook e1, I'll take on g4. I don't think I'll even take the free bishop. No, actually, knight f3, I'll take the rook. But you meant rook f3 in the other line, so I get it. I mean rook f1 in the other line. Or rook e1, sorry about that. So yeah, I think I do need to get this in right away. Anand has COVID. That's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear. I hope that it's okay for you and that whatever medicine you've taken is good. MK, welcome. We were just going over this rook lift example. The quick recap for everyone is that we started with this position where we have a clear superiority on the king side. And after rook e3, we decided the critical line was bishop f6. And black is defending with queen d6, which I thought was a really good move. And here we're looking for something really strong for white. Anand was saying to play f4, but I think you meant the other line, so let me switch back to that. I was just giving a quick recap. So we're switching back here. I don't think f4 works here, because I'll take on g4, hit the rook, and then I'm going to take on f6, and I'm like really, really safe. I think black's winning at this point. Like, you can go back here if you want. I don't really care. I'll take this. And even if you sack like everything you want to get your rook on h3, when you finally play rook h3, I'm going to play king f8 because there's no more pawn keeping me trapped on the king side. So it doesn't quite work. And this was all just like a line that we looked at for black. And this is also, I think, the second best line. I initially thought queen f8, but after g4, we have this extra option to play queen f4. And I think this is even better. We don't even have to think about all those defending lines, because after h6, there's really just nothing happening. They can take this one, After queen f6, that's it. Like if they play g5, I play queen g7. I don't think there's any attack whatsoever. If they play queen h7, king f8, and then g5, I'm still fine. Like I can just take it. That's check. Like there's just nothing happening. So let's go back to the main line. This was all after what happens if white plays g4, because we were thinking rook e3 and g4, so we're just testing to see if that works. But it turns out that after the move queen d6, we need to do something novel, something stronger. This is harder than some of the earlier examples we did today. Unless you count the first classic double bishop sacrifice with a rook lift difficult. I think because it's so well known, that kind of thing's become like a stock motif even for relatively low rated players like 1100. I might also make a video about how I think that while ratings are inflating, skill is deflating. Like at lower rating levels, you have more skill compared to like 10 years ago. But I think I also need some data to actually get into whether or not that's true. That's mostly just my feeling. People seem to care a lot about ratings, so content about ratings might do well for me. Anyway, so we're looking for some new ideas here. We should do a candidate move search. We still have all the same good things about the position. Like our king side is good. Like I think black is pretty much trapped there. For people who just joined in, we already looked at queen h6, queen f8. That's not really working. It's interesting, Shai, that you've heard other people have the same opinion. I think some people just kind of repeat whatever the streamers say these days. They'll be like, oh, I heard someone with a ridiculous name like Frou say that ratings are the most amazing thing, and then they just kind of like start repeating whatever they said. So having people with a contrary opinion, I think my opinion's a little contrarian, is kind of interesting. It means it's worth discussing, potentially. Although I have to admit, I kind of tire of like the rating talk sometimes. I think it's interesting from a statistical standpoint, but when people's emotions come into it, I just don't care anymore. It looks like Anand has also watched this video. Learn this secret to improve your rating by 400. Ancient secret revealed. Yes, everyone's watched that video. And improved by 400 points. And this is why the ratings are inflating. It's because of that video. Interesting to hear something that's not a meme from Ben Feingold. Actually, I really like Ben Feingold's attitude a little bit. He's like just a meme of himself. All that talk for a little bit about like chess drama and politics involving Ben Feingold was unfortunate. I don't think he cares about like anything about like gatekeeping secrets and stuff like that. It was just realistic to say that PogChamps didn't do anything for chess. Hot take. So anyway, how are we going to get at this king? We have like clear superiority on the king side, but g4 doesn't work. So what other moves are worth considering? Maybe candidate moves. Even if you guys don't have lines, like what moves are you considering here? And of course, if you're watching the recording, you can pause here. That is always A-okay. No one will even know because you're watching the recording. Yeah, he really doesn't care, MK. So, Anand, I'm just deliberately misunderstanding you about bishop takes pawn. I think you mean bishop g6, right? Vedant, welcome. Hope all's well for you. I know you were sick recently. Anand was too. It makes me wonder, were you guys hanging out? No, just kidding. So, yeah, bishop takes g6 is an interesting idea. If you want to start in on that line in your calculation, I think that makes sense. I'm not sure any other move really makes a lot of sense, so maybe we could all just calculate bishop takes g6. The reason I don't think any other move makes a lot of sense is, like, Oh, Vedant, I thought you said you were recently. Maybe I'm wrong. Sorry about that. Oh, okay. Someone in our server was. I just forget who it was. Besides Anand. So, yeah, the reason I don't think any other move makes a lot of sense here is that the queen's optimally placed, the rook on e3 is optimally placed, and the only way to improve it's g4, and we already ruled that out. It would take a long time to improve the rook on d1. The bishop's already well placed. We don't want to move any pawns except for g4. So it sort of suggests itself that maybe we need to sacrifice this bishop. So if we take on g6, let's see what they do. They have only really two options, because I think ignoring is lethal. So let's say they play h takes. That might be the most interesting line to start. So what do you guys think? After bishop takes g6, h takes g6, how do we continue here? Definitely not queen h6, because it'll be the same. They'll play queen f8. I think it's good to draw a comparison here with the move g4. g4 was the intuitive thing. Yeah. So if we're playing g4 in this line, bishop takes g6, h takes g6, g4. It's different now, because in the line where we play g4 directly, they have queen to f4, rook h3, and then h6. But now, after bishop g6, h g6, when we play g4, queen f4, rook h3, they do not have any moves. They're dead lost. So g4 is definitely the move after h takes g6. They don't have anything to do. It's just over. Maybe they can sack their queen, like bishop g6, h g6, g4, e5, rook h3, queen takes f6, but we'll easily win that. In fact, it just delays mate, because we'll play rook h8 at the end. So our clamp on the dark squares and then the attack on the light squares just wins there. So just to show the line for everyone, and this is something I actually haven't even put into my notes. Yeah, here we're playing g4, and like whatever, don't care. And there's just nothing to do. That's all. So they should consider f takes. Now, realistically in the game, we have to check both from this position. You can't just play bishop g6 as soon as you see h takes, because if f takes wins for black, then you're losing. So we have to calculate here as well. So bishop g6, f g6, now what? By the way, while you guys are calculating and typing, we have 2 fan battles coming up in early February, so you guys can look forward to that. And I might even play a tournament soon, so maybe you guys can look forward to me sharing some of that later on. That could be cool. In fact, one of my examples for today was from my first tournament, or maybe my second tournament since 2019, I think, which I played quite recently. I'm getting back into it a little bit. For a while, I thought it was not possible for me to do well in chess and in academics, and to some extent that's probably true, but if I play chess much more casually, I can still play at a pretty high level, so I'm kind of content to be a chess tourist at this point, for now. I'm getting less uncompromising over time, which I think is probably good for me. So it looks like no one has yet something to do about bishop g6, f g6. So let's look at it on the board. I think you guys will get it. Oh, no, I'm not sure your other message went through, because you said queen takes h7, not rook takes h7. I didn't even get a line with rook takes h7. So I'm sorry if you told the answer and I didn't answer. I just haven't gotten it yet, for whatever reason. So I'm guessing if you're telling me a move involving queen h7, that you started with f7 check. Yeah, so f7, king takes f7, I guess, is a move we have to consider. And then queen takes h7 check, like you said. And then king f8. And here you finish it off with what move? Yeah, it looks like you're getting it. The last move should be rook f3, right? Okay, so now again, this is something you would have to calculate from far away. This is one of those situations where calculation is necessary, but luckily it's easy because every move is kind of forced. So after f7, they could play a different move. They could play king g7, right? But then I think it's obvious what we do here. We just take the rook on e8. And this is winning for white. So this is what you need to see. That's all. If they play king g7, we take the rook. So this is also interesting to look at. Not even in my notes, so let me put that there. Yeah, and then here we take. If they go here, we go here. And that's it. You know, that's all she wrote. And that's the way she goes. And after king to f6, I think it should be really, like, similar. I didn't fact check this, but I think it should be, like, the same. Because, like, if you go here, I go here. And that's a fancy mate. And if you go here, this looks like a fancy mate, too. Yeah, that's all. Okay, so nice. Got some solutions here. So finding bishop g6 is a little bit tricky, but it's logical to look for it because of the nature of our advantage in the first position. But again, the rook lift is really key here. You can't just go for bishop g6 and then do the rook lift. You have to go for rook e3 first. I have a couple examples of a different nature, and we'll probably finish off with these two. This next one is a classic game. This is Mackenzie versus Bird. And then we'll see one of my games and then probably wrap it up before I lose my voice. So I'll just show the first few moves because it's fun. This is our Spanish, and this is a horrible opening. But when this game was played in the 1800s, 1883, they didn't know that. Would it count as a brilliancy? Okay, that's an interesting question. Maybe we can go back for 1 second to the Rager versus Fogel. So would this be a brilliancy winning combination? Well, brilliancies in tournaments, first of all, people only give a brilliancy prize in events that offer brilliancy prizes. I've played very few tournaments that actually care about brilliancies these days. It used to be standard that I think almost all tournaments had some kind of prize for playing a really great game. Next thing to note about brilliancies is that it's a beauty pageant. People are going to vote on whether or not they think the combination is worthy of being considered like beautiful and awesome. So almost as a rule, brilliancy prizes are going to go to a really strong player. They're not even going to really consider games from lower rated players. That's just how it kind of works. I think some aspect of the aesthetics for brilliancies is that it's somehow novel. This I would consider a sort of standard sacrifice, which is part of why I decided to show it. I have a lot of examples where it's just like amazing weird stuff that happened either in real games or in analysis, and it looks just like a study, and maybe it would win a brilliancy if someone played it. But things like this, they're more like your bread and butter tactics, things that you should just kind of see quickly, things you could do in blitz, these kinds of things. So this combination, I think it's pretty normal. This is like classical era chess stuff. Not super brilliant. Something you guys can totally do. Multiple times in your life, probably. But anyway, so this next one, this is a terrible opening, and if you guys want to know what I think about this for white, you can check my video about the Blackburn Shilling trap. This is not exactly the same, because the one I looked at was with the bishop on c4, but in principle it works like very, very similarly. The too long don't read is that you can castle or play c3 in positions like this. I think with the bishop on b5 it's quite similar. MK says he can never see these kinds of combinations. Well, I think it's important to start by training positions like that in a slow setting like this. If you can't do it slowly, you can't do it quickly. So you should train it slowly and then rapidly, and then eventually in rapid formats and blitz formats, as you get more comfortable with the ideas, you'll start seeing them more. It's just a matter of time and training. Just some patience is needed. So I wouldn't think of it as I can't do it. I would think of it maybe as I haven't done it yet. I think that's a bit more of a positive mindset, something more realistic. So in this game, Mackenzie got a lot of development against Bird. But Bird came with an interesting idea, nevertheless. So Mackenzie is trying to destabilize Black's king. And here, I don't know if I would go for queen takes e5 the way he did in the game. Here, maybe I would try to finish my development with like d4. But even this looks very, maybe too ambitious. Anyway, I just don't think queen g3 is very scary. And this is something that maybe contributed to the fact that in the next couple of moves, Black had a lot going on in a positive way. First, they played d5, just finishing the development. And you really can't take this pawn, I don't think, because let's say you do, right? I'm not taking with the queen. I'm taking with the knight, with the idea of playing. I was gonna say rook e8, but I think I'd probably start with like bishop d7. Maybe not bishop d7. You know, maybe this is not as clear as I thought. But anyway, if you take this, Black's development is very good. I thought rook e8 was coming up, but maybe not. Anyway, I really like this for Black. Doesn't matter. Hold on, I'm kind of curious now. Oh yeah, here's the defense. So I was curious about the move c4. And I was worried that we're losing a piece. Like, I'm just like, oh yeah, this is so great, and then we're just losing a piece. But maybe this is a good Black to play and defend against queen takes c5 moment. Like, how are we going to save our knight and our bishop? Hello, Eric. Welcome. Would I consider this a sharp position? Yeah, I do consider this a sharp position. I usually consider positions sharp, not when it's like they're open or something. It's not about like the chess itself. It's more like, is it really easy for there to be a rapid turnover in the evaluation? Like, are you forced to play just a few moves to find equality or an advantage? Or is it like every move is kind of interesting and different and fine? I think things are not sharp when several moves are perfectly good and different from each other, and it is sharp when you don't have many options. This I would consider very sharp. Like, Black has defined probably one move here. And the move, in my opinion, should be knight b4. Not because I want to go on c2, because the bishop's covering that. It's so that when they take the bishop, we play knight d3 and win the queen. And the game. More importantly, the queen. So, this is just kind of an interesting tidbit that came up when I was casually making moves just now. So they played d3. I guess they didn't like the looks of it. And here Black played a5, which could be construed as a multi-purpose move. Oh, c6 is interesting for MK. Let's go back. Yeah, this is kind of interesting. Probably... Yeah, this also looks good, but maybe it's not as tactical, because I think knight b4 is really forcing their hand. Like, I think Black is winning after, for example, castling. I think this is just so crushing. Like queen h4 next, probably. Depends on where they put the queen. But yeah, I like c6 too. Just blocking and intending rook e8. Anyway, so here comes a5. And White managed to castle, so good for them. And this is our critical moment for Black to play. And this one I'm mostly showing for like the curiosity of it. It's not like a tactics puzzle. Just like, how do we finish our development? It's a sort of unusual way of finishing. How do we get these pieces out? White's up material a little bit, but their development is slow. Suggests that maybe we should do something more attacking and exploitative. I think the sort of intuitive move, like the prescription formula for what to do in a position like this, would be to play like bishop e6. I think that's sort of the classic intuitive move here. But after this move, I just don't feel like it's that great. Like, it looks okay. It's probably still good. Just I don't know. I feel like there's an opportunity to finish development coming on here. Maybe even something drastic like this. Idea is if you play f6, I play queen e6. So, and if you play bishop d6, which is the move I'm trying to avoid, you might take on e7 just to get one more pair of pieces off the board. I still kind of like the compensation that they have here, though. So this might be kind of like an intuitive path, but I don't think it's necessarily a great one. Eric's saying bishop d7. Yeah, this could also be like maybe a more direct way of just getting the pieces off the board. I would probably play bishop c2 with the idea of playing d4, move my queen, play e5. I'd just say no thank you. And here I'm threatening to take on d5, so maybe black would be provoked to play like this, but here's an interesting move. Yeah, maybe they'll take now and then play queen e4. No, then this bishop f5. So this also looks kind of valid. And Anand was saying king h8 and then f5. I think he said f4 by accident, just king h8. So if we're looking at king h8 here, this move, I don't really think we want to play f5. It looks a little lazy to me. Hello, Eater Master. Welcome. But maybe it's valid. I still want to see about this. So let's see. Maybe here. Well, d3 is kind of hanging, right? So maybe I should just take this first. And try to trade pieces when I'm up pawns, and then play like knight d2, knight f3, or knight e4, something like that. Yeah, classic chess people having a lesson right when I'm streaming. Why do you guys have so many chess classes on a Sunday? Anyway, I wish I had a better time to stream that matched everyone's schedule. In fact, if you guys want to talk about stream scheduling for this year, maybe we should talk about it in the Discord. I'll make a survey or something, or doodle poll or whatever those things are called. Yeah, king h8 playing f5 doesn't really impress me that much. I don't think there's like necessarily a direct refutation. It just doesn't look that great to me. Like maybe this. I just don't think you're ever really getting an f5, f4, f3, and I think that's why you would want to do that. So our lesson's about rook lifts, right? So let's think on those lines. We have a lot of different moves to consider here for black, but if we're going for the most aggressive, and we know the lesson's about rook lifts, what move comes to mind? Yeah, rook a6. Nice. So rook a6 is where it's at, because it's the bee's knees. We're going to play rook g6 and just go get their king. All these guys, sleeping. This one, stuck mostly on the queen side until it comes to c2. And then it's going to be really hard for it to defend the king anyway. It has to like attack h7. It can't really defend. So I would say that white is pretty defenseless here. And the way the game went, that made sense. Like, they took on d5, which is... I don't know if that's good or not. It just seems not so great. They took, rook g6 happened. Basically, Henry Bird didn't care whatsoever for his material. And after king h1 to, I think, avoid shenanigans, bishop d6 happened. The pawn on d5 fell, and now the knight's coming on f4 or something. So they played f4 to prevent that. But you see black's pieces are just flying out of the gate. This is a really great position for black. I'll just show the last few moves so we can look at the last game for today. After queen f2, c6, bishop d1, bishop f5. They're just not trading, keeping the pressure. This kind of feels like it's like a martial attack kind of feeling from black. They have their bishop on d6. They have all this activity against the king, and white just has not moved. Like all their pieces are just on the back line, playing passive. And eventually, there was a tactical blow. Like this had really nothing to do except give up this f pawn. And you can see they're getting rolled, so I'll just kind of quickly go through this. Just so you guys can see, like, the finale. Never give up, never surrender. Always check. Alright, yeah, there we go. So that's how it ended. They resigned here. I guess they had enough. Yeah, miserable. Not worth really analyzing. Let's look at one of my games from recently. I played a tournament, and in the first round I played against somebody who knew me, and I think they were probably utterly terrified. I got like strong vibes that I should just play something kind of exploitative. So this game's a little bit of a maybe disrespectful opening choice and everything, but Javier, if you're out there watching this, I'm sorry, but I think it gave a good example for the Rook Lift. So I chose this kind of weird line just to test my opponent, because I've noticed that a lot of people, especially like adult type people who are relatively new, they're very bottom heavy on their chess analysis. They like know long forced lines by heart for some reason, but then like they blunder mate in one. Like I don't know what the deal is, but I thought the most exploitative way to play against a player like that would be to play something that's like almost okay and makes them make decisions immediately. So that was the reason for my choice. I immediately got the d5 break and I'm fine. And here after e5, I knew that the best move here is not d4, but I wanted to, sharpen the play and make my opponent make decisions. And I was rewarded pretty well. I sacked a pawn, and he chose one of the worst ways to claim that extra pawn, because now, after bishop a6, it's very, very difficult to castle. And here, my opponent chose a strong defending move, if I'm not mistaken, which is knight g1, which might surprise you that this is like a strong defending move. If they play a move like d3, d3, I take on c3, right? And this is probably still like their best practical chances, but against me, it's like not going to happen. There's lost here. But like maybe this is the best chance for them. But yeah, d3, they're dropping the c3 pawn, so it doesn't really work. If they play like d4, well, it's not totally never mind Utermaster, because sacking in exchange to finish your development, it's practical against someone who's a little bit closer to your level. But this guy is like 1500. And if you play d4, like yeah, there's no bishop c3, but I think you're in for a world of hurt after a move like queen d5 or queen d6. You just can't really defend your weaknesses too well. Maybe bishop e3 makes sense here, but I have a feeling that black is doing super well. I might have gotten the move order slightly off because I don't have the score sheet for this game, but I'm pretty sure this is like how things went. So knight g1, with the idea of just defending the light squares. But here, obviously their position's not that good. Like it's all their pieces are on the back line. Black has finished development. White's up material. That's like the only thing going for them. So how do we finish them off is kind of the next question. I looked at this during the game as kind of a tactics puzzle. Like, how do I'm looking for mate here. Something really strong. Really forcing. but I also need to finish my development and get at those weaknesses. So there's a little bit of like developing the pieces. It's kind of a deep calculation. You could just play this like by hand because black's position is quite good, but I think in the situation of being against someone much lower rated, you don't want to take any chances that much in a position where they could get counterplay. All right. So Unitmaster said exclamation point d5. I think you meant queen d5, and that's an interesting move. So I wouldn't just say never mind. The reason I think queen d5 is interesting is that it looks like it's kind of threatening queen c4 and queen e4 and queen e6 and queen e5 and queen g2. So it's kind of easy to be impressed by this move and play it right away. You know, like there's just so many things, they'll never solve this problem. But I think the most obvious move is queen f3. Yeah, good. So after queen f3, white is getting active for the first time in the game. And even if you throw something like queen e6, which makes a lot of sense, this is what they're looking for. They are kind of surviving for a few more moves. You know, if you make a few more imprecise moves, white could be better or like equal or better. So it's good not to be lazy, but queen d5 is an interesting line. It's definitely in the spirit of the position. The problem is just that queen f3 is happening. So queen d5 is the move you want to play. So I wouldn't compromise. I wouldn't play like queen c8 or something like that. It doesn't make much sense. I also wouldn't play something lazy like rook b8 because I think that given time, white will improve their position. So I played a move to improve my rook on h8. And not the like typical, like I'm going to castle, bring my rook to the open file or something, because that's very slow. The way I see it, white's moves are kind of forced, and even a not very strong player can find forced moves. So I want to put the pressure on them immediately. Just finish them off. So h5, Unitmaster got it. And the idea is rook h6, and you know how the story goes from here. Yeah. My opponent played bishop a3, kind of desperate. I think he just had no idea what to do. In my opinion, there's a great defensive move here for white. So I think it's a better challenge here to try to defend with white than it is to attack with black. So you might want to pause here if you're watching the recording, or to suggest what you think white should do. How do you like just stay in the game against this rook h6 idea? It's important to be accurate and precise. Yeah, MK has it. You should play knight e2, rook h6, and castle. And the character of the position is still such that black is better. For example, knight e2. I would not play rook h6 immediately. I might hold off just because it has more options now than it used to. I would probably play queen d5 here. Unitmaster, it's okay to leave up an option if you don't like it. d4 is interesting. The issue I would say with d4 is that if black castles long, there's going to be tons of pressure on d4. But anyway, after queen d5, castling is what should happen. And here, I thought that I should stop knight f4 and also put pressure on the king with bishop e5. But this is sort of a classic bishop pair position. Like you're down a pawn, but your bishops are amazing. So as long as you play very actively and keep the position open and keep them on their toes, you should be doing well. So like black has at least compensation in this position, but I think white's best chances of a defense are here. It's an interesting moment. So bishop a3, not very sharp. I played rook h6. They played queen c1, just trying to evacuate, but it's too late. Rook e6. They played king d1. And here, I played something kind of exploitative. Alright, take care, Unitmaster. Hope you can check the earlier part. I think you'll like the examples I picked. So after king d1, what would you guys play for black? How do we try to finish this off? Yeah, always play bishop f1. That's an interesting move. I did consider bishop f1 in this position. Let's take a look at it real quick. I thought here that they would play like h4 or something like that, and you're probably much better. They have to keep the knight. Yeah, I played bishop takes c3, Eric. That was true. But I think the best move might still be queen d5, because now there's no queen f3. And because the king's trapped, if you play knight f3, there's bishop e2. Wins. Easy. That's a dub. So I think queen d5 was probably best, but I thought for sure my opponent would make the blunder he did. I read his mind. After bishop takes c3, he played d3. All right, I should have given this as a puzzle, like white to play and lose as quickly as possible. It's d3, and then the classic Morphy mate or Anderson mate. I can never remember. Rook e1. So this was a really short game, and I was able to stay rested up for the rest of the tournament. Also, I thought this was a good experiment on my part, because in the past I focused a lot on trying to play the best move, and it turns out that playing the best move is an exploitable strategy in chess. It's good to know what the best move is, but to make good choices about playing the second best or even lower best move. And here, I think that my decision to take things into this territory with d4, it would probably not work against a much stronger player, like someone near my rating or above. But it was a good time to do it against this particular opponent in this situation. And it turned into a nice example of the Rook Lift. So I hope that you guys really like this example and my other examples. And if you have any questions, we can talk about that now. Maybe I could give you guys a sneak peek about the future as well. Let me switch to webcam only and then let you guys know what's coming up. So I have some recent videos about how you should think about improving, and I'm going to be continuing that series, so I hope you guys like that. If you don't care for it, that's fine. But as for live stuff, we have 2 fan face-offs coming. We have Phoenix versus Shy, and we have Yeeting Master versus Amazing Actor. So those are coming up. And I also have a few lessons about pawn structures on the docket for January, so you guys can look forward to that. Eric has a good question. What do I mean by the best move is an exploitable strategy? Well, a lot of the time you want to play the best move, but sometimes when you play the move which is considered best, it's predictable because people are analyzing with the engine. And so if you're in the opening or a situation where things are kind of expected based on how people are studying, it might be practical to play moves that are not the best move because they're sort of obvious and people know how to react to them. But if you play a move which just requires your opponent to make a lot of decisions that are not easy decisions, if it's like a new decision but it's easy, your opponent will figure it out. They'll just burn time on their clock. But if you make them make a decision where it's they have to choose among several seemingly equivalent options, it's a lot more likely that your opponent will make a serious mistake in positions like that. So I would say that playing the best move is good most of the time, but not necessarily all of the time. So thinking about when to play a second best move or third best move is starting to become part of my own strategy to play tournament chess. When I play online, I don't really care what happens, so I'll usually just do something crazy, even if I can force a draw. I just don't really care. But in tournaments, it's a different story. So maybe you guys will get to see some examples of what I mean after the next tournament. All right, if you guys have any more questions or comments, feel free to ask them now. We can probably wrap up after that, though. The pawn structures we'll be looking at on 23rd and 30th of January, if everything stays the same, are the wedge pawn structure, which happens in the Caro-Kann and the French. And we'll also be looking at the Isolani pawn structure, which is your isolated queen pawn scenario. And there are tons and tons of examples of the isolated queen pawn. I'm going to be focusing mostly on positions from Soltis's pawn structure chess book, which is quite old, but I also think it's good and it's accessible even for intermediate level players. So you'll get a sneak peek into that book, so you can decide whether or not you want to read it after those lessons. If you want to see more about pawn structures, I recently did a couple on the Marozzi bind. I'll probably have at least one more Marozzi bind video coming up in the future. Alrighty, well, I think we could wrap it up here. So thanks for joining my live stream, and I hope to see you guys next time. Alright, take care. Do I sleep with the windows closed or open? Okay, interesting question. It depends on where I'm sleeping. Alright, take care.